check those clocks, analog or digital. Maybe you have a sundial. And it's
Perhaps.
sunny outside now in Wisconsin, so you can use your sundial and see that it is, in fact, a time to think.
Does the sun change for daylight saving?
I don't actually know. I don't know. Is this I mean, are you baiting me here into something that I should know?
I'm wondering that actually. Like, what time does it actually show on a sundial right now?
Oh, are you said a sundial change based on daylight saving?
Well, there's like the sun change. Is it like? Never mind. Anyways.
Man, okay, we're going to be more knowledgeable about the next thing we're going to talk. I did want to say, Chris, I made a mistake the other day.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay.
I says to myself, I was listening through some kind of apologetic content, and I was like, oh, that kind of reminds me of a podcast we did on. Oh no, I was listening to Remaking the West by Andrew Wilson. It's kind of an interesting story about kind of Western. I wouldn't say imperialism because he doesn't have that like imperialism is
like
bad
Darth Vader.
Flavor. Yeah.
Empire.
Yeah. But he's trying to explain like the making of the West through the lens of 1776. And I was like, oh, some of this stuff sounds like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Let me go back to listen to one of our earlier episodes on like the inner self and stuff like that. And I clicked on the podcast, and it wasn't quite nails on a chalkboard, but I could tell that we were still learning how to talk to each other. And I turned it off after like 3 minutes because I was like, oh, we don't know how to butt in yet. We're both like pausing awkwardly and doing our own things. Okay. And it made me think that even if you've known someone for, 7 years, if you put two microphones in front of you, it
can be awkward.
You have to learn how to talk again.
Yeah, exactly.
So for anyone that has recently listened to our old episodes of A Time to Think,
We're sorry.
You saw it get better, I hope. Chris was just remarking about increased audio quality. It's been nice to not listen to inconsistent pops and different levels. So just a couple.
And today we're recording in a different space.
Yeah,
so perhaps you're going to hear a little different audio quality. You're being surrounded right now, I'll tell you, by Funko Pops and theological volumes and Legos and bobbleheads and other things that occupy my office space.
Because we're in Chris's office.
Yes, we're in my office right now.
Which is one of the reasons we got these new microphones maybe 6 months ago, was so that we could do mobile. So this is our first try at mobile. I mean, we've thought about, you've got the forum. We've thought about doing a live podcast at the forum. So this just gives us some more opportunities to do various things. You are listening to A Time to Think, which seeks to be a thoughtful, careful engagement with issues involving the culture and the church. We are in a series on apologetics. And the last two episodes we talked about what and a why of apologetics for the first episode. The second one, we really breezed through some definitions of apologetic method. And so there are really broad overviews. We talked about classical apologetics, which basically says you need to first prove God exists, and then you can prove from that miracles, primarily the resurrection.
Which is a very Enlightenment style approach.
Rationalism, right? Then you have evidentialism, which is another post-Enlightenment style approach that deals with, sensible, observable facts, right? So we're going to look at the Bible and the resurrection through historical lenses, and we're assuming that history and historical method is neutral. Everyone uses the same methods, and so we can...
And reasonable people should come to the same conclusion by looking at the same evidences, right?
So both of those, where you mentioned the Enlightenment, they deal with some sort of neutral ground, supposed neutral ground. Presuppositionalism, by contrast, says there is no neutral ground. There's only common ground, but common ground is a Christian's ground. Yeah. So rational thinking is Christian thinking, because we'll get to this on the next episode, but to be able to think at all presupposes that you've been designed with thinking capabilities.
Which may sound arrogant, even to a Christian person, to make that kind of a statement. But if we understand, this goes back to Calvin. This goes back, way before that. But the idea of thinking God's thoughts after Him, that if God has made this world, the way that we interpret this world is only rightly done if we see it through the lens of the one who made it. Yeah. Right. So if I decide, I've got a couple of Toyotas, I love my Toyotas, and I take a look at the engine. I'm going to change the oil. I've got to change the oil sometime the next week or two when I sufficiently recovered from my hernia surgery. I'm going to go out there, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to double check to make sure that I have the correct number of quarts that go into the oil. Okay, so the oil system is going to occupy space, and we need to put the right amount of oil in that so that what's pumped into the engine is going to lubricate properly. Well, if I decide that, hey, I have an idea. I have an idea of what this is going to look like.
Great start.
Yeah, I have an idea of what this is going to look like. Then, I'll just go out there and I'll just dump it in until it's full, right? And it comes to the very top, because who wouldn't want something to be more full?
Yeah,
and not
the more
less,
the
right?
merrier.
The problem is you'll cause your engine to have compression issues, and it'll just slop out. So you need to take a look and understand, if I want to know what this vehicle does properly and understand it rightly, I better consult the one who made it. Mm-hmm. And that's what presuppositionalism really does. It says there are no such things that John Frame talked about. There's no such thing as like bare facts. Right, not like bear facts, like grizzly bear facts.
There are grizzly bear facts.
Right, there are grizzly bear facts,
yes.
but BARE facts. There's such thing as like a naked fact. Everything has a sort of interpretation that's attached to it, simply because you have to understand something in context.
Yeah,
and that's what presuppositionalism, supposes.
Yeah, and so to really dumb down the three approaches overly simplistically, you could say that the classical method is faith based on reason.
Yeah.
We can reason our way to faith. The evidential method is faith based on evidence. Mm-hmm. Because we have the evidence, we have the confidence of faith. And then you have presuppositionalism, which basically says
it's biblical.
Reason based on faith. We can reason at all, we can think at all because of the Christian worldview. Yep. So those are basically three. I think we'll see today, particularly with the resurrection, is there's an overlap, and really it's about emphasis. And really what the presuppositional worldview emphasizes, that we'll want to emphasize, is two principles that James Anderson has called the no neutrality principle and the no autonomy principle. And the basic principles are, no one is neutral in their interpretation of facts, right? So you look at a bear and you either say some product in the chain of evolution that is part of the material world, or you say some part of God's creation that was created according to its kind being different than the kind of an ant and the kind of a human. But in either way, you look at a bear and your presuppositions determine how you see that bear. The same with a tree. Either the tree is part of a somehow finely tuned ecosystem that came about by random mutation, or it is part of a divinely ordered
beautiful
cosmos
design
that proclaims the glory of God along with the sun. So your presupposition, when you look at the thing, now where that's going to matter is because the evidences of the resurrection, just like the evidences of the Bible that we talked about in our last podcast, they don't change.
Right.
It's kind of like looking at a tree. The evidence don't change, but if you come to the evidence with the position that miracles can happen because you believe God exists and he can do miraculous things, well, you're going to interpret the evidence one way. If you come to the evidence with a naturalistic, materialistic, we can only explain things in this world by things in this world.
Right.
Only by natural. Well, you're going to come away with a different interpretation of the evidence.
Which is why some people, just kind of little tangent here, why some people believe the resurrection without having loads and loads of evidence that might be presented to an unbeliever and say, no, still. It doesn't mean that individual is dumb. It doesn't mean that they've been sufficiently won over because they have the lack of discernment, that belongs to somebody who's just a fool, right?
Yeah.
It means that faith genuinely precedes faith. And it seems like a strange thing to say. But, to trust the evidences presupposes that a trust has been given to an individual to trust where the evidences are being authenticated and the authority behind the evidence to begin with. So for those of you who are listening right now and you're like, oh, I didn't even know this. This is really helpful to know. That's great. And just understand that the goodness of your faith is bound up in the fact that God gave it to you to begin with. And so for you to hear facts about the resurrection, evidence about the resurrection, those are just simply things that can help you as you consider, yes, this is not just faith, it's a reasonable faith. And that's what I think we want to come across with all of this. So.
Yeah, and that's where going back to the what and the why of apologetics. Apologetics, Van Til has said it's the vindication of the historical claims of Christianity against objections. So I'm preaching on Philippians 2, 9 through 11 on Easter Sunday. And one of the points that I'm going to make is that the resurrection vindicates Jesus, right? So the Jesus who was humiliated at the cross in the worldly position was proven right. He was justified. He was vindicated through his exaltation.
Yes.
So that's Cornelius Van Til. You've got other, Peter says, give a defense for the hope that is within you. One of the things we said on the first podcast is that apologetics is reasonably defending the reasonableness of Christianity. So with your character being a reasonable person, not given to slander or argumentativeness or hatred, but reasonably, sober-mindedly defending the reasonableness so that you as a Christian could be reminded of its reasonableness, or you could, at the very least, make clear the narrow road to the non-believer. Say, this is a really reasonable narrow road to walk down, and the only reason you're not walking down it is not because it's unreasonable, but because you don't want to, right? And so just defining really the task of apologetics here. And as I said, Cornelius's last name, Van Til, you picked up 2 books, just so you can hold them in your hands, or what?
Yeah. Oh, I might be trying to reference through our conversation here, but I do like Van Til a lot. I really do. So
we kind of had an ad hoc meeting, an as necessary meeting to try to fit this podcast episode in, because we wanted to get an episode about the apologetics of the resurrection prior to Easter Sunday. Yeah. Martin Lloyd-Jones basically said, don't be dominated by current events, but don't miss a chance to talk about what everyone's thinking about.
There we go. Yeah.
I'm sure Time Magazine has already put out or will put out
Marcus Borg or
something on the resurrection, right? New York Times, this is a time where even non-believers talk about the resurrection. So we want to give you not only food for your own thought, but ideally, if you find this helpful, something to share with a friend or someone in the church. Before we get to maybe what you would think we'll talk about, which is the evidences of the resurrection, that's where we usually start. Before we get there, I want to talk about something called absurdity.
Here we go.
This is a word that I keep seeing pop up, particularly from William Lane Craig. He'll talk about an argument, a cosmological argument and an objection, and he'll say, that's absurd. And he kept saying that's absurd. And he has a whole chapter that I think is worth the price of his book, Reasonable Faith, on the absurdity of life without God. The rest of the book is fine.
Which is actually part of the transcendental argument for the existence of God.
It is. Yeah. So that probably the most presuppositional thing Lane Craig does in his book is that chapter.
And he is not a presuppositionalist by any means. So.
No, because it's a worldview focused chapter. So if you get lost with the word presuppositionalism, broadly speaking, it's a worldview focused apologetic that focuses on the Christian worldview. And so this word absurdity keeps popping up. And so I messaged my professor and I was like, is absurd a
word?
It is a word.
Have you heard?
The bird? Okay. Is it just a philosophically recognized category of absurdity?
Sure.
Because William Lane Craig's a pretty decorated apologist, and he just keeps calling things absurd. But I seem to think that's a slam. Like, that's absurd, right? And so I think it's helpful to talk about this for 2 reasons. Number one, we do want to eventually show that there is an absurdity to many of the arguments against the resurrection.
Yep.
We'll go through stuff like the tomb was not actually empty, or the body was stolen, or the swoon theory that Jesus was only kind of dead.
Mass hallucinations.
And eventually we want to say that's a pretty absurd argument.
Right.
But there's also, I think, a part of this that I want to touch base, because I was at a breakfast this morning. There was a Lutheran apologist that came over from the Twin Cities, and I noticed something that I want to be aware of and not do on this podcast, or encourage our congregation not to do. He would say things, and he didn't really do this, it was just people from the crowd. He would say something that was absurd, right? Okay. Some theory of like
the Vikings will win a Super Bowl.
Oh, goodness. Pause for sad music. So, for instance, there is one theory that the disciples just had the wrong tomb.
Right.
It's really an absurd theory because the tomb was known. The Gospels tell us whose tomb it was. Yeah. The proclamation of Jesus' resurrection happened in the same city that he died in. I mean, to think that they just... all of them
showed
just
up with the wrong address
is an absurd objection. And I would hear him say something that kind of like led to that, and then I'd hear someone laugh, just chuckle, like, can't believe anyone believes that.
Sure.
And what I think we need to do as we're being reasonable defenders of the reasonableness, part of that reasonability is being able to show someone the absurdity of a claim without laughing at it.
Without saying that they're absurd, right?
Right. So how do we do that, Chris? How do we pursue defending the rationality of Christianity and the absurdity of an objection without doing that thing where it's like, I can't believe anyone believes that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of the same approach that I would say when it comes to issues of gender and sexuality right now, because I think if you're steeped in a biblical ethic regarding gender and sexuality, there are certain things that are just absolutely, that just seems absurd. Like we use the word absurd again, right?
Yeah.
So, I deal with this when it comes to my children. Because as my kids will interact with the world around them, they're, in the, we're from 4 to 16 in age, right? So they're interacting with a world that is very openly defying God's design by allowing, people and championing people who decide for themselves what they want to be as human beings. And so what I tell them, because it seems absurd to them when they see somebody like a man dressed as a woman claiming that they're a woman, right? So for my children, like, well, this is crazy, right? And yes, on one level, we say the concept and the practice may be absolutely insane, right? Absolutely insane. But that individual is an individual that matters and significant. And so like when we're talking with that individual, we can't treat them like this is somebody who is just like basically, off the shelf, clearance priced, damaged goods.
Yeah.
Like, who's this person anyways? What we want to do is recognize that this is absurd, and the absurdity of this, it's basically like saying, what is the final, the end step? What is the end game of sin in its distortion of facts and reality for people? And you see this in Romans 1 as Paul talks about, just how people are given over to themselves over and over and over again. And when we think about this philosophically, when we think about this with worldview, when we talk about evidences and so forth, what we want to be able to do is recognize that, like, if we are proper presuppositionalists, which I hope everybody who listens to this ultimately walks away with the idea that faith precedes faith, right? So confidence in what God has said is preceded by something God has given somebody. What I want people to be able to do is to look at these things and say, you know what? I can't expect a non-Christian to behave in a Christian way, and I can't expect a non-Christian to believe Christian things, because if they did, they'd be a Christian.
Yeah.
Right? So like, I can't look at an unbeliever and say, you silly unbeliever, how dare you unbelieve? Like,
Sure.
that's what's going to happen.
As if you weren't at one point a stranger to the
Right,
commonwealth
exactly.
and
Yeah.
without the hope and promises of God in this world.
Yeah,
Ephesians 2.
One of our dear friends who's right now our elder candidating process, evaluating is he going to be a good fit for us as an elder in the future. Name is Kevin, and he has a phrase that he likes to use that helps people see this. Says, "Heathen's going to heathe." So it's just what's going to happen. To expect a non-Christian to behave in a Christian way, it may be a benefit of common grace, but it's certainly not an expectation that you can hold. So when you're interacting with somebody, please don't make the approach, kind of commonplace that, like, how dare you not believe this?
Yeah. Well, another way to put it is that if you're going back to that sentence, reasonably proving the reasonableness of Christianity, then the answer is not on offense to unreasonably prove the unreasonableness
Right. Yeah.
of another worldview. It's to reasonably
Yes.
prove the unreasonableness of the other worldview.
Yep.
And so really without us, we ourselves entering into the absurdity of being unreasonable, we're trying to show the absurdity of a position.
Yes.
And I bring that up because one of the things we want to do with the resurrection, I think it's common to just start off with, and this is kind of what the Lutheran apologist said this morning. It seems like it's a strategy that's worked for him. I'm sure it's a strategy that works. Is he'll just say to someone, "What do you think about the resurrection of Jesus?" And that's his conversation
question.
starter. Yeah. And then that leads to evidences and facts. And I think that as you're just knowing your friends, remember that triangle we talked about with John Frame, triperspectivalism. So if you're imagining a triangle, the triperspectival approach, the top of the triangle is norms that roughly equates to like rationalism, rational
Like the
thinking.
guy from This Old House, Norm.
Yeah, or
Norm Macdonald.
or Norm Macdonald. And the lower right corner, so the top is norms. The lower right corner is situational. The lower left corner is existential. And so basically the three parts are kind of objective something, factual evidences, situations, things and people around you is the situational, and then personal experience is the existential piece. I think we can, without oversimplifying things, maybe put some different people in our lives in those categories and think, oh, this person tends to think more like, no, they're objective, reasonable, rational things, or this person tends to think more of historical evidence, or this person tends to think more of what they've experienced. I do think, though, that a lot of the apologetic approach of starting with the resurrection and here's the evidences works best for certain types of people that are already given to thinking in terms of historical
Who are
evidences.
those types of people, Josh? What would you
I think I would mostly be one of them.
I think I would have been the same because we both grew up in a church, right?
Yeah.
Both grew up in liberal, mainline Protestant churches. And so for us, I think there was an assumption probably that we believed something about this, but somebody has to kind of tell us why it matters the way they say it matters.
Yeah, or there has been a distinction between maybe an older generation, ours, that was asking the question, is it true?
Yeah.
And a newer generation that's asking the question, does it work?
Right.
And so I think that's where the divide is if someone's asking, does it work? Then to a degree, they might say, well, great, there's all the evidences in the world, but who cares?
Right, who cares? Yeah.
So why I want to start with this idea of absurdity is it answers the who cares before you talk about the evidences. And so here's where William Lane Craig, I'll put the ball on the tee for you. He says, life is absurd without two things, God and immortality.
Okay.
We'll talk more specifically about God in the next podcast where we do existence of God apologetics. With the idea of immortality, Craig basically says, if your life ends when it ends and the world ends when it's obliterated, life is absurd.
Sure.
There's ultimately no meaning, value, or purpose to your life if there's no resurrection from the dead. And so the flip side of that would be to say, the resurrection of Jesus, or without the resurrection of Jesus, there is no hope in this world. Riff on that. Like, what do you think about that idea that if we boiled it down to the resurrection of Jesus, which is the Bible says the first fruits of our resurrection. It's the proof that death doesn't win. It gives us hope that there can be a resurrection and restoration of all things. And without that, there's nothing else in this world that gives any type of life after death and eliminates the absurdity of just being obliterated at some point in the future.
Yeah. I mean, this was the post-Enlightenment struggle of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, right? So you get to people like Camus and Kafka, and as they write, they're writing from the perspective of like absolute existentialism, which, bleeds into nihilism, right? So if somebody is experiencing the world as a matter of bare experience, raw experience, personal experience, you get to a point where you ask, why does this even matter? Right.
Yeah.
And so you ask the question, why does it even matter? And it doesn't in these instances, right? So you think of like Camus and The Stranger, and like you have a guy committing murder because he can. He's a guy who commits murder because he just like felt like it. It's just how it happens. And so, I think there is, I don't know that one can prove things from what Craig has said, but I think that is an appeal to a sense of, there's a Latin term, the sensus divinitatis, right? Which is like the sense of divinity that humanity bears. And it's just like inside we know there are certain things that are true. Inside we know there are certain things that are right. And I think the idea that there is nothing after this is a resignation statement. I don't think it is a statement of genuine belief that typically occurs in most human beings, which is why every culture has some sort of belief in an afterlife. Now, that could be, and if somebody is coming from a worldview of atheism or agnosticism, can say, well, that's wishful thinking, and that's true. It's wishful thinking. It can be wishful thinking, but when you take this idea of wishful thinking, why is it wishful? Why is it that people want to believe this? Do dogs believe this? Right? Do bears believe this? No, they absolutely don't believe these things. We believe these things because as rational people, we're challenged to think, well, this is irrational to believe in life after death because you're not there, right? But it's more rational to believe in this idea of irrationality because the absence of that irrational place or idea, concept, whatever somebody wants to say, causes this present experience to be completely irrational, right? So why should, the big question that any, I would say, atheist has a burden of proof to kind of hold up is why? Why?
Yeah.
Why do anything?
Ultimate why, not just the local. Okay, why love your kids? Well, because it's better for my family,
right.
And it feels good, and I like it, and it's ultimately better for society. That's the local why question.
Correct.
But
yes.
The ultimate why, really, that Lane Craig is getting us to ask is to say, if you die and your kids die and their kids' die and everyone dies and the earth dies and there's nothing, then why?
Right. Exactly.
Like that's the ultimate question. And that's where he's trying to get us to see the absurdity that if the ultimate end is nothingness, then the why is irrational. Like why do people build societies if the earth is going to burn?
Right.
Why do we engage in art and culture if it's meaningless? That's really what he's trying to get with this. If life stops and there's no immortality, life is absurd.
Yeah.
And you're right to say that this doesn't prove Christianity, But I do think in a culture, it disarms someone and maybe makes them interested.
Yeah.
Because my gut is that if we just go up to the average person and say, what do you think about the resurrection of Jesus? They might not care.
Sure. Yeah.
But if we can get to them to see that their worldview is not working, that the kind of meaning, I mean, the suicidality of our culture, the meaninglessness and despair, the mental health crisis everyone talks about, that these things are rising out of the earth being unchained from the sun, as Nietzsche says, that God is dead and here's been the product.
Right.
We're not better off. Nietzsche basically predicted if we kill God, then we will have less fear in the world. And Michael Reeves in his book, Rejoice and Tremble, has said, hey, there's more fear now than ever because we've killed God, philosophically
Isn't
speaking.
that telling where you think about, the major, champions of the 19th century in areas that, did unchain from what we would say in the West is kind of Judeo-Christian ethics and philosophy and everything. And you think about the claims that were made. Darwin's claims that are made saying, you know what, we've just scratched the surface, literally we've just scratched the surface of the earth. And over the next several decades, we're going to find a myriad of evidence supporting this position of evolution. We're going to find transitional forms all over the fossil record, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What has happened in that process? We haven't found those things. So instead, we've kind of come to a place where we've said, all right, let's create an entire worldview built on something that we don't actually have evidence for, but because of these ideas, we got to go with this. We got to run with this. You look at Nietzsche, you look at somebody who's like, that's completely remove God from our philosophical frameworks. Let's do that. And that's going to lead to liberation. It doesn't lead to liberation. People are just in absolute wreck right now. Look at Freud and psychology, the advent of psychology and a godless psychology. I think, all right, this is going to cause people to really be healthy, functional, beings who can walk around this world and really understand themselves. And we're at a point right now where people can't even function with basic biology determining how they see themselves. So, I mean, all of these things unmooring ourselves, the promises made 150 years ago, this is where we're at right now. So.
Yeah, so I think maybe if you're looking for a way to engage with someone with a startup question, I would just advocate to start off with, what is your hope in this life? Most people, I think, we have this constant weird collision in American culture of luxury and despair, luxury and anxiety.
Yep.
Like, okay, why? Like, let's help people see that the rationalist, materialist worldview is not led to ultimate meaning and purpose and hope in life. And so if we can, particularly in regards to the resurrection, here's one apologetic question is, what is your hope? And if someone, you start to see like, my hope is that I'd be able to retire. My hope is that my kids would be able to leave the house. And you say, why does it matter?
Right.
You can start to engage with someone in a really curious way and eventually try to help them see that it without God and immortality, it doesn't ultimately matter, but they know it matters. So
exactly.
What's the rub here? And then we can present Jesus as the one who has triumphed over death and shows us that our moral actions do matter because we will have judgment after death.
Yeah.
Our hope in heaven does matter because it's guaranteed by the one who's conquered death. And that leads me to the pastoral here, which is there are so many things that happen in this world that the resurrection is like the only thing you can tell someone.
Sure.
Like someone gets diagnosed with cancer. Someone, I had someone in my life call me asking for prayer because they work in a church and they're ministering to a family whose husband just took his life. I mean, you've got so many things. People people lose contact or have just really rough emotional relationships with their children.
Yeah.
All of these things aren't fixed with it'll get better. And they're certainly not fixed with a subconscious, well, the world will burn and
It's
then
going to burn anyways. Yeah, exactly.
But if we can see that in the resurrection of Jesus, God has triumphed over sin and death, and that all who trust in him are united to him and get everything he has in the new heavens and the new earth, when not only our bodies are resurrected, but the earth is
itself,
resurrected from the decays of sin and death, man, that's a promise that the decay of sin and death that I'm experiencing right now will ultimately be fixed. And that's an ultimate why, right? And so this is not ultimately just an intellectual question, but it's a very pastoral, it's a very discipleship-related question where we need to think of the resurrection as the only hope we have in this world for life after death.
Josh, what is your only hope in life and death?
You want me to sing it or you want me to quote it?
Please quote it.
That I am not my own, but belong body and soul to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, who has, oh, by the way, been raised from the dead, right? And so when we're talking about the resurrection, let's not miss the fact that there is an apologetic concern not just about evidences, but about whether or not someone else's worldview has any hope for life after death. And that's a way we can press and present Jesus. There are evidences, though. I mean, it's kind of at times hard to distinguish between evidentialism and presuppositionalism or classical apologetics when you're talking about the resurrection, because it's so evidence-based.
Right.
Arguments about God tend to be more theoretical. Arguments about the resurrection are historical. I mean, they are evidences. And so the question is, how does the presuppositional worldview deal with evidences in a different way? Well, broadly speaking, what at least James Anderson has advocated for is to start off by saying the Christian worldview is the only worldview that can explain the evidences.
There you go. Yeah.
And so what that does is it's a little bit different than anyone with a brain will understand the evidences.
Right.
Because there are many people who have seen the evidences, and they'll say, liberal scholars or atheistic scholars will say, yeah, the tomb was definitely empty. And they're not going to be in heaven because they don't believe in Christ. And so we have to have some sort of something that's more or less neutral than just, well, if the evidences are presented. And so where the presup, if you will, approach is coming in is saying, we want someone else to compare their worldview to the Christian worldview and say, their worldview does not have the explanatory power or scope. This is what William Lane Craig talks about, explanatory power, scope, and ad hoc arguments. Meaning your worldview needs to be able to powerfully, like forcefully defend the evidence. It needs evidence in scope, right? It can't just explain the empty tomb, but also needs to explain the disciples' faith. Also needs to explain the appearances. And if you can only answer one of those three, the scope is pretty limited because you're going to need three other arguments, right? So you need power, you need scope, and then you need less and less and less ad hoc arguments, which means you're not always on your heels making something up. Where you're like, well, they must have gone to the wrong tomb. And well, why you say that? Because it's rational? Well, no, because I need an argument because I already don't.
So it's like an existential, a normative, and a situational perspective.
Tell me more.
Interesting.
What do you mean?
Well, no, I mean the existential perspective as far as the power. It's like this is something that's going to ultimately like kind of capture and make sense of things. With the normative perspective. So the other two you said we have the situational, which is so we have scope.
Scope, power, ad hoc.
And ad hoc. And so scope is just like, that's kind of your normative where it's like the facts and make sense of things. And then the ad hoc arguments, which is situational. It's like, all right, let's answer some questions. Let's deal with some things that are specific to a particular circumstance. So,
yeah. So the basic difference is saying we have two worldviews talking in this conversation. We have the non-believing worldview and the Christian worldview. And my argument is the Christian worldview can make better sense of the evidence. And therefore it's rational to believe.
Absolutely.
And so let's talk about some of the evidences, Chris, because that does matter in regards to the resurrection. Do you have any like personal experience where you're like, man, this evidence was compelling to me or has been compelling to me?
Yeah, I never, kind of hearkening back to what you said, a few minutes ago, as far as people who are more prone to believe certain things. I've never struggled with the resurrection. Okay, as far as the concept of the resurrection, because I grew up in a church setting, my issue ultimately was just, my heart was not, submitted to Jesus. That was my problem, and so I had a lot of things in place. I had a lot of things not in place, quite frankly, as well. But as far as like the big historic doctrines, I never stumbled over the Trinity and never stumbled over the resurrection or anything like that. So I can't say there's ever been an argument that's persuaded me of something that I didn't need persuading of. But I do think, as I've talked with people over the years and, had conversations with folks who may have questions about things, I think, honestly, one of the most compelling things, especially in our current culture, evidence of the resurrection really has, I don't want to say nothing to do with the resurrection itself, but just the consequences.
Even when we get to the evidence of the
resurrection,
exactly. We're not even talking about the resurrection.
Yeah, but it's just the consequences of the resurrection when it comes to the lives of the people who witnessed the resurrected Christ. So, when we think about what would somebody be willing to do to support a truthful claim or a lie? What would somebody be willing to do? And what would multiple people be willing to do? And how far would they go with that? And so you think in the first century, you have a group of people who claim to have witnessed the resurrection of Jesus. We have these claims made directly in the gospel accounts themselves. We have Luke, who's basically saying, "Hey, there are a bunch of people who saw this happen. I interviewed these people." And so we have individuals who had firsthand encounters with the resurrected Christ, whether it was from afar, whether it was up close. And what did these people generally do? Right? How did these people respond to that? And the response of the people who encounter the resurrected Jesus was to literally go to their graves saying that this is the most significant thing that I've ever witnessed in my entire life. And that's also, bear in mind,
and not go to their graves in splendid retirement.
Right, exactly.
But go to their graves earlier than they probably should have.
Yes,
at
in
the
horrific
forceful
ways.
hands of torture.
Yes, exactly. And all they had to do was keep quiet about this. Now, you also want to kind of put a little spin on this by thinking, all right, there is another account in the Bible of resurrection that takes place, and that's Lazarus, right? Now, do people respond the same way to Lazarus being raised from the dead? Now, the Pharisees, religious leaders in Jesus' day, did not want Lazarus' resurrection to be widely known because it meant that Jesus was something significant, right? But more than that, nobody went to the grave over Lazarus' resurrection because the understanding
Except for Lazarus.
Right, yeah. Oh, boy, guy, pun, there we go.
They're like, he's back. Yep. Let's go get him.
Let's do it.
This poor guy.
But when it comes to the resurrection of Christ, there is redemptive historical significance attached to it, which is why those who witnessed that resurrection went to their graves over it, because they knew that it meant something more than the fact that somebody had been physically dead and is now physically alive. It's the reason why today we don't, go to somebody in an emergency room setting whose heart stops for 30 seconds and say, "Oh, you've been raised from the dead." The point isn't the stoppage of human life. The point is what that stoppage was in its action, right? So why did that death occur? And then what does this being raised from death actually mean?
I think you're spot on, and not just because I think so, but William Lane Craig thinks that you're spot on.
Wow.
He's known for wanting to have some apologetics will talk about minimal facts. They want the simplest explanation. And what's helpful about that is I do think for the average Christian, it keeps us from swimming in all. I mean, like I read the cosmological argument. I'm like, I don't even know what I need to know.
Sure.
But when it comes to the resurrection, he really boils down what we need to know to three things. We need to be able to explain the emptiness of the tomb. We need to be able to explain the appearances of Jesus, because there were many claimed experiences.
Right.
Now, some people are going to explain that through a psychological category, like, hey, Paul just saw him in his mind, which doesn't make sense of the fact that other people fell down as Jesus appeared to Paul. But that's a
and that he hated this Jesus prior to seeing him in his mind. Right?
And that leads to the third thing, was that you have to deal with the sincerity of the faith.
Yep.
It's not just that people believe something, but it's that their belief was sincere enough. They weren't propagandizing. I mean, we read the gospel document. It's not propaganda. You can actually tell the difference between communist governments that change history and gospel accounts that reflect history, that you can just intuitively with common sense read the difference. And so Craig says, if we can have a worldview with the explanatory power and scope to deal with the emptiness of the tomb and the appearances of the Lord Jesus to not just people who already loved him, but also to James and Paul, who did not believe he was the Christ prior to his death, and then also to 500 people. And then we can say that those appearances led to a sincerity of faith for which they were willing to die, that the Christian worldview is the only worldview that can explain those three things in totality.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's helpful for us, Chris, because now we're not swimming in the sea of evidences. We're really boiling it down to those three things.
Yeah.
And that really is where the objections go. It's, well, the tomb must have not been empty. Okay, so one of the series of objections would be they went to the wrong tomb, which is basically trying to deny the empty tomb.
Sure.
The swoon theory, which says
You just passed out.
Yeah.
Which, if you've ever been crucified, that didn't happen to you. You died. Right?
So let's talk about the swoon theory and see if it answers these three things. It explains the empty tomb, it explains the appearances, and it explains the sincerity of the faith.
Yeah.
It could theoretically explain the empty tomb. Okay, so if you're saying Jesus was on life support after his crucifixion, but not dead, and then he got up, and then he did physically appear to his disciples because he still was physically alive. He just never died.
Yeah.
That would explain theoretically the empty tomb. But would that explain the appearance?
Right.
Would Chris or Josh seeing a mangled
Right.
man believe the risen Lord?
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
Okay, probably not. Would that account for the sincerity of faith? That now I'm willing to die because I've seen
A guy survived crucifixion.
right. And so when you talk through this one through, you say, okay, well, it has 50% explanatory power for one of the three major things. It's really not all that convincing with the tomb thing because, and this is where it's helpful to enter into the objection. You say, okay, this is really what the Lutheran apologist did very well this morning. You say, all right, let's suppose we're in the tomb and Jesus has been crucified. And he's been embalmed. He's been wrapped up with linen cloths, and he has spices and myrrh and oils on him that are sticking the cloth to his body and probably have some sort of heavy degree of weight. He's been hanging in a position where most people die by asphyxiation for quite some time. He's been stabbed in the side, and he has a stone rolled up against the front of his grave. He's not actually dead, so he gets up. He's able to somehow get unwrapped and get the stickiness and the weight of everything off.
And push a giant stone.
And then he's inside the tomb, right? So the leverage of pushing a stone from inside versus outside is different. Now, suppose that happens, he has to get past the guards who are there. And so you start to enter into this objection, and maybe if someone has that, you want to help them see the absurdity of it, right?
Exactly.
Say, like, can you actually imagine that happening? And then that man still being upright to appear to his disciples. And so that would be one example of hearing an objection, and instead of just kind of laughing it off, saying, okay, let's enter into that objection and see what it would actually take to make that true.
I mean, you think about, personal experience. So I had surgery last Monday, right? It was fairly minor surgery, right? Hernia repair, and made small cuts, tiny little cuts in me. I'm still not feeling great. Like 9 days later. And you're thinking, my brother-in-law who did the surgery didn't beat me, whip me,
we didn't even talk about flogging.
Right, exactly, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, for a good couple days there, I mean, I was icing and ibuprofening just left and right. This is what was happening. So, again, you think personal experience. If you've ever had surgery, if you've ever been in a position, like if you've gotten in a fight, somebody is punching in the face, or like, are you in a position a couple days later to get up and do these things? Absolutely not. It's just not going to happen. So.
Yeah. So, we keep going through other objections. We want to say the Christian worldview is the only worldview that can explain that there was an empty tomb. Okay. The resurrection makes sense of there being an empty tomb. If he can get out of the cloths by rising from the dead, he can get out of the tomb, right? The resurrection makes sense of the appearances. He's raised bodily and he appears to people, and his body's different. It's, it's renewed. He's got...
To the point where Thomas is like, I don't believe this. He would have believed if he saw a guy that just got beat up, right?
Yeah.
But he couldn't believe that he saw this one made whole in front of him.
Which tangent that probably one of the things that has helped me most as I read the historical documents is someone calling to ask about the resurrection. You might have heard a little phone there in the background. So I'm just going to talk to no one as Chris leaves the room, but we're still recording. So for you who are still with me, one of the things that has been most helpful to me apologetic wise is I think by some called the criteria of embarrassment. And it has to do with portions of the gospel accounts that seem embarrassing for the people in the accounts, or even maybe seem embarrassing that clearly can't be propaganda, right? So if you're writing religious propaganda, you don't include Thomas doubting.
Correct.
If you're writing religious propaganda, you don't, right before the Great Commission, say some believed but some doubted. If you're writing religious propaganda, you don't portray the future head of the line of the bishops for the centuries as someone who denied Jesus 3 times. Right. And so you read the Gospels and you realize that this is not written as something that is supposed to make everyone look good. I was talking as you left me, Chris, of the criteria of embarrassment. Yeah. And I'm saying that kind of helps me to pinpoint these things. You don't make up an account with which the women rather than the men were the first.
Sure.
It's not that women were women weren't dogs in the ancient world, but they weren't as trusted. as men.
And they could not enter into legal testimony.
Right.
Their testimony would not be believed or trusted in a court of law.
So when you're thinking about what parts of this story are actually embarrassing for the account, it leads to historical credibility. And so we're looking at just this explanatory power, explanatory scope of the three categories: the empty tomb, the appearances to Jesus's apostles, to people who were not yet Jesus' apostles, like James and Paul, and to a group of 500, most of whom Paul says, 30 years after the resurrection are still alive.
Right.
So you can go check. So Paul says, hey, they're still alive. You can go check. Luke says, I did. I wrote it down.
And you would never say that if it's like, hey, Josh, I got to tell you something happened in high school. Now, you can't verify this.
My
right?
reunion's happening and you can go ask.
Yeah, exactly. Go talk to them. Ask them if this story I told you is true. I mean, that would seem like absolute insanity for me to try to encourage you to do that. But that is one of the welcoming truths about the Bible itself, is that the Bible invites you to ask questions. And I love that fact. I love that.
So let's talk about another persuasive to many modern people objection is the hallucination issue.
Sure. Yep.
Right. So what if the disciples, they didn't want Jesus to die. They were sad when Jesus died.
Yeah.
So they wanted him to be the Messiah. They were predisposed to wanting something. And so rather than see him bodily, they hallucinated. That seemingly explains the appearances, right? And of those three, it seemingly explains the appearances, but not really even that one category.
Right.
And it certainly doesn't explain the other two categories. What's wrong with the kind of hallucination objection?
Yeah, so I mean, in hallucination, there are hallucinations that take place, right? There are group hallucinations take place. Usually they're under the influence of a substance, right? The majority of the time it's under the influence of a substance. And so, when you think about this idea, and what's interesting, just as an aside, is that a lot of these objections have fallen by the wayside as the people who use them to basically justify their liberal position on the inerrancy of Scripture have died.
Well, they've fallen by the wayside in scholarly circles.
Yes.
But they haven't always fallen by the wayside with your neighbor.
Yes, they persist in popularity because somebody heard it 20 years ago when they were in college, and that's that. But when it comes to hallucination, let's think through how the hallucination theory might work. So could it account for genuineness and sincerity? Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, there are some people who are like, I am so convinced that this happened. And, there's a guy I knew years ago who claimed that God had commissioned him to be the next Apostle Paul. Now, this guy was sincere, but he was actually on a lot of drugs. Right? Like, that's just the reality. The guy was a frequent drug user. It's like, I think I'm going to have another explanation for this, but you sincerely believe it.
So hallucination could explain the reason someone would die for this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, if you think about the other factors involved here, you think, all right, an hallucination does not account for an empty tomb. An hallucination does not account for guards who have basically fled in terror. An hallucination does not account for the fact that there are people who disbelieved. An hallucination does not account for the fact that typically if you're going to hallucinate, so if I have a good dream, right, something that I want to happen, I have a dream, like, all right, I'm going to think through what is the best outcome in this dream. I'm not going to be corrected in my dreams, right? So if you've ever had a dream and you're like, oh, this is great, I want to wake up from this, it's not because you're being corrected, it's because your wildest dreams are coming true, right? It's like vote for Pedro. So when you're thinking about what happens in Acts chapter 1, how does Luke record the interactions of the risen Lord Jesus with the apostles? It's like they ask him a question. They say, Lord, now are you going to restore, this Israel? This is going to happen. Like, this is going to happen. And Jesus says, it's not for you to know the time that my Father has fixed for this.
Yeah.
So even in this resurrected state, he is correcting them. He's correcting
that's really interesting, Chris.
their assumptions about what the resurrection would mean. And so from that point
which
forward,
digs against the fact that hallucinations, if the argument is disciples were predisposed to believe this, they wouldn't be predisposed to believe wrong things that had to be corrected.
Yes.
And that hits at the fact that, one of my professors has said, like, you can have some sympathy for Jewish readers of the Old Testament that didn't just always see Christ pop up. Because it took the death and resurrection of Christ to help us see
the apostles
Christ,
themselves,
right?
Yeah.
And so there is this weird assumption of two things, that the Jewish people were just expecting a singular resurrection. Mm-hmm. They weren't. They were expecting an in time everyone resurrection, not a group resurrection, not a singular resurrection. and that they were predisposed to thinking that the Messiah should be crucified. If, in fact, many times in the Gospels, Jesus says the Son of Man must suffer and die.
And they say, no, 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 no.
Right. So you have historical witness within the Gospels themselves that they were not predisposed to the death of the Messiah.
And that their belief that they had held led to them doing very foolish things.
Yeah.
Right. And so one of the, you kind of look at the situational evidences here then with the hallucination theory is that you have a group of women who believed it right away. Right, because they saw, and then you had other people like, I didn't see. So like, if we're thinking about hallucinations here, is an hallucination localized? Are these women who go to an empty tomb and they see the risen Lord Jesus saying like, is this an hallucination that only exists in this one place? How is it then that the Lord Jesus appears among the disciples, and then it's like, oh, I believe, like, are these like localized hallucinations? Like, that's just not what's happening. I can understand if somebody might say, all right, there was a group hallucination that occurred one time in one place, and that might seem like, okay, well, maybe something occurred, right? But we're talking multiple appearances of Jesus to the point where the Apostle John, who is writing his gospel in part to counter docetic theory that Jesus just appeared to be a human being,
right?
That he's God, but he just appeared to be a human being, where in the resurrected state, he has one of the disciples put his finger in a wound, and then he eats food.
Yeah.
Right. So hallucinations don't do this, and hallucinations certainly don't correct previous beliefs when somebody is predisposed to believe like, hey, guess what? I don't think that this could happen. It's like, no, yep, put your finger here. And you go to a beach and you see Jesus. And Peter is terrified about seeing Jesus. He's just absolutely mortified that I should see the Jesus that I betrayed. And he comes and he's corrected, and he's like, even to the point of, hey, Peter, by the way, this is how you're going to die. And then Peter's like, no. What about John? What about, like, this isn't an hallucination. These are not records of hallucinations. These accounts, just like when we go to Genesis, these are accounts that are written as history. These are records. This is not just wishful thinking.
So if you're looking for, does the hallucination objection answer the three big ones? It has to answer all three: the emptiness of the tomb, the appearances, and the sincerity of faith. You could say that it really improbably answers the appearances. Maybe you could make an argument that somehow through chance a lot of people had a similar hallucination, but you're really stretching there, right? It's not impossible, but it's a real stretch to think the group of women and the apostles at the tomb and the apostles with the meal with the fish,
dozens of encounters,
and the 500 and Paul and James all had the same type of hallucination that goes against previously held beliefs with
new information being revealed.
That's highly improbable. And it also does not do anything, as you, I think, alluded to earlier with the empty tomb.
Right.
All right. It's one thing for Chris to say, Josh, I had this insane experience in Los Angeles. And then Josh is like, and I had this insane experience in Los Angeles 100 years ago.
Right.
Okay, well, I can't get to the time or place right now. So I can't verify it. It's another thing for you, we're in Stevens Point, Wisconsin right now, to say, hey, 3 blocks away, there is this wildly insane, unbelievable thing. And I could say, well, okay, let me just pause and I'll go 3 blocks away. So to say that everyone was trafficking in claiming to have seen Jesus because of a hallucination, and no one, no Jew, no Roman just went to the tomb and said, well, he's there.
Exactly.
It does nothing to explain the empty tomb, right? Yep. And so it does not have the power or forcefulness really to explain even the appearances part, and it doesn't have the scope to explain the burial part. Any other objections that come to mind that people, as you're defending the resurrection of Jesus, people typically lob or...
Stolen body.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one that I would probably, if I weren't a Christian, I'd probably be like, oh yeah, well, it's a conspiracy. Okay. So I think conspiracies for some, especially in the age of the internet, we tend to want to think that we found new information somewhere potentially, and that explains something that we find to be, some type of leveraged argument that we don't want to agree with. And so I could see somebody easily saying, hey, well, but the body was stolen, right? So that's why the tomb was empty, is because somebody showed up and in the dark of night, chloroformed the guards or something, rolled the stone away, stole the body, ditched it somewhere that nobody would ever find it, and then basically concocted this theory of a risen Jesus, right?
So that brings to mind something that I think is interesting as far as evidence for the resurrection. So we're told in Matthew that that's the claim of the Jews, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of the evidence we have for the resurrection comes from the Gospels. And so it can feel at times like we're saying, so let's say someone says he stole the body, and you say, no, actually Matthew's Gospel says that that was the claim of the early Jews.
Yes.
Because they were trying to figure this out. Mm-hmm. So we're even told in the Gospels that that's going to be one of the main objections, and that objection is dealt with by the other witness of the Gospels. Mm-hmm. Can someone not just say, well, of course they just foresaw that objection, wrote it in there because they wanted to make sure that they had really covered all their bases? Yeah. How do we approach? We see that objection and the defense of that objection, but it's in our book, if you will. Mm-hmm. Like it's in our Christian literature, it's in the Gospels, and people see that as biased. Mm-hmm. How would we approach that?
Yeah, well, I mean, you really have a couple of choices when it comes to anticipated objections. It's either written in there as a matter of propaganda, or it's written in there because that's a common objection. So sure. if somebody comes to me and let's say you're a salesman, you're going door to door, and you're selling vacuums, right? So you're a Kirby vacuum salesman, and you go to somebody's house and you're trying to sell them on a $2,000 vacuum cleaner. And as you're going through this, you realize that it's a hard sell. You realize it's difficult maybe to sell somebody a $2,000 vacuum cleaner. And so you say, now, I just want you to know. I want you to know this is worth it because. And they'll say, because this happened to my parents, right? My parents bought a Kirby in the late 90s. I got suckered into it. It was one of their used models, I think. Now, still to this day, I think they have it. It's a great vacuum cleaner. So just a little thumbs up there for a 25-year-old vacuum. But
so we cannot tell if Chris is pro or anti-Kirby, but move on.
I'm pro the Kirby my parents have. I think it's a great vacuum. But that being said, so the salesman comes in, and he's anticipating objections because he knows that his role here is to convince you that it's actually the case. But in the process of anticipating the objection, he actually goes out of his way to show that this objection doesn't mean anything because this will do what I say it does.
Yeah.
Right. So the vacuum, guy will say, hey, you know what? This is so powerful. It can help clean your bed. All right. I think, Pshaw, why do I need my bed clean?
Right.
And I'll say, well, you've got pounds of dead skin and dust mites living in your bed. You're like,
okay,
whatever. So he hauls out the Kirby, puts it on the bed, takes a filter thing with it, and just starts sucking junk up through there. And you're like, oh, I've been sleeping on that. And so the objection is there, and there's an appropriate response built into his pitch because, look, if he's not going to satisfy that objection, he won't bring it up. So if you're thinking like, now, I'm just going to conveniently not include this because I know this is my Achilles heel.
Yeah.
So I won't include potential objections that I know are not true, in terms of my claims, because I know that's where I'm going to be weakest.
Yeah.
So it makes no sense to have one of the gospel authors bring that up as an objection if he can't answer it sufficiently.
That's a good point. And it brings us back to whether or not the gospels are written as propaganda.
Right.
The criterion of embarrassment would tell us probably not.
Right.
That there's a lot of stuff that's pretty embarrassing, just like there's a lot of stuff in Genesis, which we'll get to in just a week. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't look great for Abraham. It shows us that we could meaningfully see this as history, not propaganda, because it's not making the patriarch look great sometimes. Yeah. So if you just read, and this is where I think common sense comes in.
Thomas Paine?
No. This is where common sense comes in, where you can just say, here's the Gospel of John or Matthew. Does this read as propaganda? Right? And you're appealing to someone's cognitive faculties, believing as a Christian that God has given them cognitive faculties, hoping that the Spirit might illumine them through the Scriptures.
And let's be clear, there is persuasion and there's propaganda, right? So when we preach or when we're talking, right now with people, we're seeking to persuade, but we're not seeking to propagandize, because propagandizing is basically providing a multitude of facts that aren't actually verifiable or true, just because we are so insisting that somebody believes something against all belief.
Yeah.
That, don't question what I say. I'm just going to put a whole bunch of stuff right in front of you. And therefore this must be right. Jehovah's Witnesses and
there's a difference between don't question what I say and I'll answer the questions
exactly
about what I say, because there's defense. Yeah. So going back to those three categories, does the stolen body address the empty tomb? Yeah, kind of. I mean, it's a decent objection to say, let's deal with the fact that the tomb must have been empty. Does it explain the appearances? It can't. I mean, you have to have, this is where the ad hoc as
It's
necessary.
not Weekend at Bernie's, right? That's
No, you have to combine the stolen body with the hallucination theory.
Right.
And as you're adding hypotheses on top of hypotheses, you're getting exponentially less likely. So you have to have the unlikeliness of the stolen body times the unlikeliness of the hallucination theory to get just those first two categories. Does the stolen body explain the sincerity of the faith to which the disciples would die for? It doesn't make any sense that, and it seems incoherent to say, well, they stole the body, but then the hallucinations explain the appearances, and it's the hallucinations that lead to the sincerity of faith to die, but they know they stole the body, right? So a stolen body does nothing to say, why would Peter die for this?
Right.
And so that's where it's helpful to have all three things in mind: the empty tomb, the appearances, and the sincerity of the disciples' faith that led to their death, almost always. To say, okay, does the worldview, and you can ask the non-believer, does your worldview explain all of these?
Right.
And if it can't, then you say, the Christian worldview does.
Yeah.
The resurrection of Jesus explains all of those.
Yep.
He resurrected bodily, as he said. The tomb was empty. He appeared bodily. He showed his hands and his feet. He ate fish. They thought he was a ghost. He said, let me prove I'm not a ghost.
Yep.
He appeared to Paul, who was a Christian crucified, or no, I'm trying to be too cute here. He was a Christian persecutor.
Yeah.
He appears to Paul. Paul completely changed his course from outpacing his peers in the faith to being killed by his peers.
Right.
James, Jesus' brother. Jesus' brothers think he's crazy at first. All of a sudden, James is leading the church in Jerusalem. What makes sense of that change? Really, the Christian worldview is the only one that knocks out all three. And it's the only worldview that's not constantly coming up with ad hoc arguments to say, well, it must have been this other improbable thing to make that improbable thing happen. The only improbable thing is that Jesus was resurrected.
Right.
And this is where I think it's helpful. William Lane Craig has distinguished between evidence and explanation. He said a lot of people that are naturalists, a lot of people that are modern historians want to say that a supernatural explanation is not valid in history.
Right.
And what he helpfully says is, well, the historical facts are not supernatural.
Right.
The empty tomb is not supernatural. The appearance claims are not supernatural. The claims themselves, the disciples' faith and their death, none of that is supernatural. The supernatural is the explanation of it, right? And where it's helpful to distinguish those things is just to say, from our perspective, a non-believer is coming up with a really irrational case. Yeah. And we're trying to show them that the seemingly irrational resurrection is the more rational explanation, the more reasonable, the more likely explanation. So that's a lot. I would encourage you, this sounds self-serving, but you may have to go back through this again. One thing I've experienced in apologetics is I feel like my head is swimming and I'm just like, there's no way I can keep up with all this evidence. That's why I've tried to repeat those three things over and over and over again. But you may have to listen to this again, or you may want to read a book to reinforce it, because sometimes it can feel like new content, or sometimes it can feel like so much content that I'll never remember it. But what I've experienced is, as I study it, and then maybe I go listen to someone talk about apologetics, I'm going, oh yeah, I knew that. Yeah. It's just part of the learning process where you have to hear and then reinforce. So maybe you want to listen to us again and see like, oh yeah, that makes a little bit more sense now than it did. I see how the meaning thing ties into the evidence thing. So this has been one of our longer episodes, but we hope a fruitful episode of A Time to Think, and one that would lead you to hope in the resurrection of Christ, and maybe you even to present the hope to a friend. See you next time on A Time to Think.